Welcome to the UCL Institute for Sustainable Resources online seminar, Accelerating Clean Energy Transitions Through Post-COVID Recovery. This is the first in a series of webinars exploring the future of the fossil fuels industries. And I'm very proud that UCL and the Institute for Sustainable Resources is at the forefront of stimulating such an important debate. It would be hard to think of a better person to launch such a program than Dr. Fatih Birol, Executive Director of the International Energy Agency. Dr. Birol will discuss the work the IEA has been doing in response to COVID-19. This will include the findings of the IEA's Sustainable Recovery Plan that it put out as part of its World Energy Outlook series. The IEA is, of course, the flagship institution established by the OECD governments 45 years ago to advise on energy policy after the oil shocks rocked the global economy and to help manage oil security. It has also become the leading source of global energy data and in many eyes the leading authority on international energy issues, including, of course, response to the challenges of climate change and now COVID. Under Dr. Birol's energetic leadership, indeed, it has grown further in its global profile and the level of activity, including, remarkably, 3 major international reports published in the last 3 months, including the Sustainable Recovery Plan. After Dr. Birol's talk, the chair, Michael Grubb, will invite a short period of Q&A with Dr. Birol as he has unfortunately to leave before the end of the meeting. But we will then move to our other 2 highly expert respondents, Professor Yacob Mulugetta, Professor of Energy and Development Policy at UCL, and Sean Bradley, a Senior Research Fellow in the Energy, Environment and Resources Programme at Chatham House. There will also be an opportunity for wider discussion. Just a few more words by way of introduction for Dr. Birol. He has been named by Forbes magazine as among the most influential people on the world's energy scene and was recognized by the Financial Times as Energy Personality of the Year. He chairs the World Economics Forum's Davos Energy Advisory Board, and he serves on the UN Secretary General's Advisory Board on Sustainable Energy for All. Dr. Birol, it's a great honor and pleasure to have you give this seminar, unfortunately not physically at UCL, but very much as part of UCL in the electronic environment. So thank you very much indeed. We look forward to hearing your lecture, and I will now hand over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Provost Michael Arthur, for that very, very kind introduction. And many thanks to Professor Grubb for invitation for me to kick off the UCL's new Future of Fossil Fuels Industries seminar series. I mean, just before I start about the energy issues, I should say that I have great utmost respect for the UCL, and I have 3 reasons for that. One, we have been recruiting a lot of colleagues from UCL recently, and one of them is with me, Mr. Christopher McGlade, one of the recent, I should say, colleagues we hired, and I am extremely happy with him, and as well as many UCL colleagues. So this is one reason. Second, Mr. Arthur, a personal reason, you said I am not there today, but I have been to UCL many times because my daughter spent 8 years in UCL, studied throughout her career, and I have been there several times in this beautiful building, waiting for her, just leaving the library, which she was always late, of course, and I was waiting there. but she finished her PhD there, and still we have wonderful memories with UCL. Third and the last reason, one of the why I have so great respect for UCL is that one of the, I would say in quote, energy or environmental philosophers, if I may say so, that influenced me a lot came from UCL, Professor David Pearce, whom I wanted to remember here with great respect and admiration for his work. The late Professor David Pearce was, in my view, one of the leaders of thinking, looking at the energy environment from a sustainability perspective. So once again, thank you very much for giving me the honor to kick off this seminar series. Now, I would like to talk about two things. One, COVID. It is affecting the economy, it is affecting the social life, and as such, it is affecting the energy and climate trends, numbers, industries, and so on. And I wanted to say what is happening there as a result of COVID in the energy and climate domain, and what the IEA is also, how IEA is responding to this challenge. And the second, the role of oil and gas industry in clean energy transitions. What role, if any, and what kind of discussions happening around the future of oil and gas industry, and what we see in terms of clean energy transitions and the future of this important industry. Now, first of all, COVID and energy. We are at the IEA, we are number of people. We are about 330 experts on energy. We love numbers. When we talk, we wanted to base our words, our decisions, and everything on numbers. As soon as the COVID became a serious issue, I asked my colleagues, the first thing what we need to do, the measure the impact of COVID, the damage assessment. And is only 5 months after the COVID started, we look at the impact of COVID on the energy use. So when we look at the 2020, we expect that the global energy demand this year will decline about 6%. And to be honest with you, about 5 months of the this expectation is data, 7 months is our projection. So what does 6% decline in energy mean? To put in a context, we all remember the 2008-2009 financial crisis. After that financial crisis, global energy demand did also decline. And the decline in 2020 is 7 times larger than the decline in the year 2009, after the financial crisis. To put in a context, how grave this decline, this fall in energy demand is, we are facing. It is happening in all fuels, oil, coal, gas, even electricity. For example, when you look at the electricity demand is during the lockdown days, especially, they were, if I may say so, easy like a Sunday morning. Very, very similar to Sunday trends. And only renewables does increase this year, but a very small increase compared to what otherwise would have been. So huge impact, historic impact on energy demand this year. As a result of this, we also see that the global emissions, CO2 emissions, are declining as well. And our numbers show that this year, global emissions may decline about 8%. And what does 8% mean, decline? It means this decline 1 year erases the growth of emissions globally in the last 10 years. Huge decline, bottom down, going very, very down. But I personally don't think that this decline in emissions, as somebody who worked almost 30 years to bring the emissions down, I don't think that this decline is something to celebrate or to be cheerful about. Because this decline is happening not as a result of right government policies, new technologies, but it is happening because of the economic meltdown, the premature deaths of thousands of people around the world. And in my view, the key topic today, we should be all meaning the colleagues who are keeping a close eye and a warm heart to fight against climate change, should be thinking, how do we avoid a rebound of these emissions with the economic recovery? It is the reason already in March, IEA was one of the first, if not the first, globally, made an early call to say that clean energy should be at the heart of the economic recovery. Now, since the oil, gas, coal, renewables are affected, so were the companies and the energy investment trends. Every year, we look at how much money is invested in the entire energy sector. Power plants, refineries, windmills, solar panels, everything. And what we expect this year is the global energy investment will decline about 20%. Historic drop. All the energy sector, oil, gas, renewables, everything. And this means a decline about $400 billion US, never seen in the history. And this is, of course, this plunge is troubling. We see implications on clean energy transitions. We see implications on energy security and others. I wanted to have a word on oil, especially, since you are discussing the fossil fuels, oil being the most important fossil fuel. Oil, all the energy carriers have been affected, but oil has been affected disproportionately, much worse than others. Why? Because oil is not only affected as a result of the declining economic activity, but the very fact that the big chunk of the year, more than 4 billion people were in confinement, and the transportation constitutes about 60% of the global oil consumption. Oil is affected two ways: economic downturn and the confinement. Therefore, beginning of April, I said month of April may go in the history of oil industry as Black April. Black April because of the big decline in demand, and two major oil producers had, as the press call it, a price war between them. And indeed, after we ring the alarm bells of a Black April. We have seen for the first time in the history minus oil prices in the US markets. And oil being one of the important cornerstones of the global financial markets, seeing the possible implications of the global financial markets and the global economy, I asked the G20 presidency, Saudi Arabia, to organize an extraordinary G20 energy ministers meeting, which was successfully convened and brought many ministers around the table. Now, in terms of oil, there is one issue I will not discuss now, but we may discuss during the Q&A session. Some colleagues in academia, some thought leaders, and some CEOs of some major oil companies said 100 million barrels per day of oil, which was consumed just before the COVID, is the peak of oil demand. Oil will not go there again. I don't necessarily agree with that argument, and I believe in the absence of government policies, this is underlined, in the absence of government policies, with a strong economic recovery, we may well go back to 100 million barrels per day and even beyond that. Now, as International Energy Agency, we thought, yes, we said clean energy should be at the heart of the sustainable recovery. But how do we come up with a sustainable recovery? What governments need to do? Because we do not, as IEA, we do not live in a different planet. I know very well what are the main preoccupations of the governments today around the world. Number one preoccupation is today economic growth, recovery of the economy. Number two is the jobs, employment. And anybody makes a suggestion without considering these top priorities of the governments is, in my view, risking to not to be heard very, very carefully with the governments, because they want to create jobs or reduce the unemployment, which will come as a big wave in September and beyond, and rebound the economy. Therefore, we prepared, as Professor Arthur mentioned, we prepared, together with the IMF, working with the International Monetary Fund, a sustainable recovery plan, looking at the next 3 years, 2021, 2022, 2023, which energy policies governments need to give a priority in order to boost the economic recovery, create jobs, but at the same time, avoid the peak in the emissions and put the emissions in a structural decline in line with our net zero emission goals. So there we look at all the energy policies, and Mr. McGlade was one of the key authors of this report. And we said in the beginning, three energy policies are critical. Number one, efficiency. Improving the efficiency of the homes, the insulation, heating at the homes, fixing the windows, which create jobs. energy efficiency. Second, acceleration of the installments of solar panels, windmills, and the others. And third, modernization, strengthening of the electricity grids. So these are the three areas, and implementing them, we found out that globally, it will boost the economy more than 1 percentage point, create 9 million additional jobs, and put the emissions in a structural decline trend. And we have received across the world, demands from governments to work together in order to adopt a sustainable recovery plan. Because, as I said several times, even those governments who do not put climate change as a key priority need to deploy these energy policies just to create jobs, just to boost their economies. And it is the reason we have put this report together with IMF, and we are very happy with the work now we are doing, not only with the energy ministries of the countries, but also with the finance ministries. We also put another report, which is very important, on innovation, on the energy technology perspective. Professor Grapp is very familiar with this work. What we are saying is here, there is a stark contrast between many governments, companies, one after another, setting net zero emission goals for 2050, for example, and the maturity of the clean energy technologies today. Our analysis show that almost half of the emission reduction needed for 2050 requires acceleration of technologies which are not mature, which are not ready for the market yet. So you cannot reach those emission goals by sending tweets or even much more aggressive tweets next time, or having different activities. Yes, we should do those, but we should also do other things such as research and development. Our report also shows that on one hand, we see growing push for addressing the climate change by many governments, which is very good, but R&D, public R&D expenditures in the last 10 years was globally basically flat. They did not increase. R&D for clean energy in the last 10 years globally did not increase a millimeter. And this is in stark contrast with the, again, the goals we have put for the world. Now, we as the International Energy Agency, after making a first call globally, clean energy should be at the heart of the economic recovery. Second, making a damage assessment of COVID on the energy sector. Third, preparing an exit plan, a sustainable recovery plan for the world. As a last point, what we have done is that I have Professor Arthur invited all the energy ministers of the world to come together on 9th of July to discuss the acceleration of clean energy transition. And to my surprise, pleasant surprise, we had 40 ministers, 40 around the world, discussing on 9th of July These ministers included all world powers, US minister, Canada, Mexico, Brazil, all European ministers, COP26 president of UK, Minister Kwarteng of UK, Chinese minister, India, Indonesia, Japan, all of them came together. With the investors, with the civil society, what I see from here, from that meeting, which was in a transparent way, viewed by 1.7 million people around the world, which gave me the impression that there is a growing momentum. Because there are countries who came to this meeting who don't put the climate change as a top issue for that. We all know those countries. They came at a minister level. And I see that there is a growing momentum. And it will be such a great pity, in my view, once in a generation opportunity if we don't make the most out of that. But as IEA, we are very much determined to lead the global clean energy transition with governments, with companies. We are working together. But the momentum is unique, momentum behind the sustainable recovery and momentum behind the clean energy transitions. So this is the first part of my words. I want to say a few things on the oil and gas industry and leave the Professor Grab for his comments. There is a growing discussion on the future of oil and gas industry. As Mr. Arthur mentioned, I have another hat. I am the chair of the Davos World Economic Forum advisory board, and I go to Davos since 13 years every year. I have never seen, like last January in Davos, almost all the CEOs of oil and gas industry are talking about the transition. Sans exception, without any exception, everybody. Companies from Middle East, companies from Europe, companies from Americas, everywhere. But of course, they all, or most of them, understand different things on the from transition. Now, from IEA perspective, we work with all of those companies. We have two red lines to make I would say, a common sense debate and a structural debate. One, we will need oil and gas still several years to come. To ask for, to demand for, tomorrow no oil, tomorrow no gas, in my view, is not a realistic demand. We need an orderly transition. We will need oil, we will need gas for several years to come. This is one. Second red line, no oil or gas company will be unaffected from clean energy transitions. Full stop. They will be affected through different channels, through investor behavior, through technological change, through the growing role of electricity in the energy consumption. They will be affected. So, therefore, we made a report which we have released in Davos to take the picture of the oil and gas industry. I asked my colleagues, can you please quantify, because many oil and gas companies say we are making also expenses for clean energy in addition to oil and gas. As I said in the beginning, we love numbers more than the statements. I asked my colleagues, Mr. McGlade and the others, can you go company by company and quantify in the year 2019 how many percent of the spending in the oil and gas companies went to clean energy or the, let's say, non-core investment, non-oil and gas investment, and how much for oil and gas investment, the spending? The answer was very clear. 99% of the spending was on oil and gas, 1% was on clean energy investments. 1 versus 99. But I know that it changes from company to company, and recently, many companies have said they are going to increase this, their share of the clean energy investments there. And I believe many of them are doing and will be doing, and we need them. It will be less difficult and less costly if the oil and gas companies are part of the clean energy transition process. They have a huge engineering experience, know-how, deep pockets, and they know how to run complex projects. There are some, I mentioned a few minutes ago, there are some technologies which are not mature yet. Oil and gas companies can help to mature out those technologies, such as carbon capture and storage, such as hydrogen. Some of them are experienced in the offshore drilling. They can translate this experience into offshore wind energy. So therefore, it will be excellent that if the oil and gas industry becomes the part of the solution. And I believe many of them are going in this direction, but not all. I appreciate very much that there is a growing investor pressure on the oil companies. This is good. But dear colleagues, again, numbers. We have found out that the publicly listed companies where there is an investor pressure are responsible only less than 25% of the global emissions. 75% comes from the companies which are not publicly listed, and out of that very strong pressure. You can increase the level of pressure on 25%. You should, you could, you may, but 75% is there. And it is 75% today, and the growth of emissions are coming from those countries. So therefore, I wanted to put also that data point in our discussion. Now, we believe that there is a lot of the jobs to do by those companies. First, they have to reduce their own emissions, their operations, getting the oil under the ground during the transmission. About 50% of global emissions come from their own operations, and they can fix the methane leakage. It's an area that we are working a lot. Methane is a very powerful greenhouse gas. They can minimize the methane venting and flaring, and as I said, they can be a part of the technologies which are not mature yet. Of course, if they wish so, we wanted to put these things on the table. Now, I wanted to finish by saying that the climate change challenge is a tremendous challenge. And I would very much like to invite everybody, before making bold, sweeping arguments, have a look at the numbers, study the numbers. I would finish with an appeal, if I may, using this the kickoff lecture I am giving here, which is the great honor, of course, once again, I want to underline. When I have the discussion with different fora, with different colleagues, it can be in a university, it can be in Davos, it can be with my colleagues having a drink in the cafe and others. Everybody has, or many people have their own favorite clean energy technology. Some like wind, the other like solar, the other one like nuclear, the other one CCUS, the other one efficiency. But if we look at the numbers, if we really study the numbers and see the time we have to fix this problem, to put the world on track to reach net zero, as in the UK, net zero in 2050, we do not have the luxury to choose our favorite clean energy technology. We need all of them. If some country doesn't like this one, the other country may use the other one. So therefore, it is for me, my plea is, the time is not to boost our egos, but to reduce the CO2 emissions. And I hope we can all move in that direction, and hopefully we can all together making the most of the clean energy technologies available and will be available to address this major challenge. And I believe the energy industry should be a part of that answer to this very important question of our century. Thank you very much.
Well, I think we have some visual clapping from the provost there. Welcome all of you listening. Thank you very much, Dr. Birol, Fatih. It's a great pleasure to have you, and I can well understand why your office said no, not going to run through all of the usual statistical PowerPoints. Anyone who wants the data, it's all there in the reports, but it's the messages and implications that matter. So thank you very much. Now, let me say just a word about the rest of this session. We have almost 300 people registered interest to participate, which of course makes it a little tricky to just have a straightforward discussion that some of you may be used to. Also, Fatih Birol has to leave in about 10 to 15 minutes. We will have some discussants, but I'll take a few Q&As first. Now, I know Michael Arthur, I believe you also have to leave in a few minutes. So operationally, let me just say, we are in a webinar mode of Zoom, which means you don't have a chat function or you can't raise your hand. If you want to raise a question, please type it into the Q&A. I will keep an eye on those and try and pick up a couple of key questions to relay. Just while those people are getting their heads around that Q&A function of typing, perhaps I could just, as an introductory question, turn to the head of our institute, Paul Eakins, and then Michael, if you want to add any final thoughts before you have to step out, I'd invite you to do so. But the rest of you, do feel free to start typing, but it will be Q&A to Fatih for a few minutes. We will then have the discussants and a longer discussion afterwards. But Paul, I think you have a potential question for Fatih.
Well, indeed, and thank you very much indeed, Fatih, for a very insightful presentation, as I was expecting. I've been very greedy, and I've got two quick questions, just to pick up on some of the things you said. The first is really the implications for the financial markets, if it is indeed the case, as we all hope, that we get a green recovery that keeps these reductions in fossil fuels, and that indeed gets on track to meet the Paris goals. What are the implications for financial markets, for stranded assets and those kinds of issues, given that quite a lot of the hydrocarbons under the ground will have to stay there? And the second I think you kind of clarified this question. You called for more R&D and were implicitly critical that governments didn't seem to be increasing their R&D budgets. Where do you think the balance should be between actual research and development and deployment of some of these technologies that need to be matured? I think you mentioned CCS and hydrogen. You may want to, one may also want to think about batteries or other forms of energy storage, etc. Well, where do you think the balance should be between something that I as an academic would recognize as research and development and what others may regard as kind of demonstration and deployment projects? So those are my two questions, just to pick up on what you were talking about.
Michael, if you wish, I can get a couple of questions and I can answer all of them if you want. If you have other.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, I will take a short cut then. I am conscious, Michael. I was warned you also need to depart. Is there anything you'd like to add? Question or comment from the provost? You're muted, Michael.
Commonest words in the English language for the last 5 months. You are muted. Yes. Apologies. Just a comment, if I may, and just to reflect a little bit on the purpose of a seminar, and it is, of course, to share information, data, and new interpretations, but it's also to generate new ideas, new friendships, and new partnerships. And I think mission accomplished. It's been really, really good to listen to you, Dr. Birol. I wasn't aware that your daughter was at UCL for 8 years, but I am now, and you're welcome back any time. So when the COVID experience is over and we're back to normal working, or as near normal as possible, it will be a great pleasure to meet you and to share some time with you. And thank you very much for inviting me to be part of the seminar today. I've enjoyed it immensely, Michael. Thank you.
And thank you for joining and introducing us. Much appreciated.
Okay, bye-bye then.
Thanks very much, bye-bye. We've had a rapid response to my flagging of the Q&A line. We've got 6 questions here. A couple I think we defer to later. Fatih, would you like me to just read out a few that I think are most relevant, and we'll return to you to pick those all in and wrap up, so you'll have a fair old list. So I think if I just start, the first off the marks was from Lewis Worthington. Interested to hear your thoughts on bailout for fossil fuel industries, and in particular, the calls for conditionality, decarbonisation conditionality on those bailouts. Then there is a rather broader question on, given the conditions, the geopolitical conditions, nationalism, certain anti-globalization trends, how could individual countries facilitate the exchange of cleaner technologies, and the manufacturing powers have to rise to the global challenge? That was from George Lee. Alec here has asked a question, said, thank you very much for the talk, but has the EIA looked at the potential impacts of disrupted supply chains and knowledge flows for the clean investment, especially in emerging markets? Another strong thanks from Julia Roundtree, but saying 2050 does look terribly distant given the current emergency. Do you actually see economic growth, at least in the normal model, as compatible with the task at hand? How important do you see the potential lifestyle changes running alongside the more technical dimensions of energy transition? We then had one other, which I think I'll probably defer, but it's about oil exporting countries. Can they invest in renewables? I know that Siân Bailey will be speaking partly to the dilemmas of those countries. So if you're feeling strong, we will pick that up later. But that was a great clutch of questions to kick off with. Fatih, you can address all of those in the time remaining. We'll be very impressed. But over to you.
Thank you very much, Michael, for all these great questions. I will start with Professor Ekins' post questions, but Paul, I don't know if you ever hear this, but we mention you a lot when Christopher is next to me. I know he's your student. Thank you very much for raising Christoph. He's one of our rising stars here coming from UCL. I should mention this to you, and thank you once again to teaching him so many good things. And I am also learning from him on a daily basis on many areas. So thank you very much for that. Now, standard assets, it is coming. It is coming, but it will be, in my view, mainly it will be an issue of coal rather than, it will be oil and gas as well, but it will be mainly on coal. This is, and also coming from, mainly coming from Asia. If I can put the things in a context, when we talk about the climate change, we focus on oil and gas because of the companies are there, they're in the newspapers. But of course, we know that the coal is the most important contributor. And when I say coal, to make it more simplify and focus, 50% of the coal today is used in China, other 50% rest of the world put together. So what China will do in terms of coal will affect everything. Coal markets, coal prices, coal investments, and so on. But I believe, including in many emerging Asian countries, we will see some of the coal, especially in the electricity generation, may well say goodbye to their operation before their economic, well before their economic lifetime. We will see that. And I believe in terms of oil and gas, we may well see companies positioning themselves much faster than the coal companies around the world. R&D, but again, standard assets will be an issue, but mainly on coal. R&D, in my view, when we look at the numbers, not in my view, in our numbers, both of them, both the deployment, but also the research part is lacking. But the biggest problem in the research part, money research is not going on clean energy, very, very low. So in last 10 years, in nominal terms, being stable means in real terms, it is declining. And what a world we are in, everybody wants to find a solution to climate change, and the technologies that will help us to find a solution, their research is going down. I mean, in terms of COVID now, we all want to find a vaccine. It is not very different than to cut the research budgets for COVID vaccine. It is not very different from there because they are really not growing despite the government statements in many parts of the world. Bailout. Now, I believe all the supports, the different types of industries should have a conditionality or a string attached in order to provide incentives to them to make their operations more efficient, more resilient, and more environmentally friendly. Now, what is happening in the emerging markets and the disruptive changes? There are, to be very frank, not all the emerging markets are today ready for making big disruptive changes because of their economic situation now after the COVID, because of their technological know-how. But if I can take one or two examples, or let me take one for the time, India, solar and batteries. So this can be, because in India, the problem is India has a lot of sun, huge sun, such solar, But when you need the electricity the most in India, in New Delhi, when you go home in the evening, turn on the air conditioner, turn on the light, turn on the television, and it is in the evening. There is a mismatch there. So therefore, I see, and we work with India on that, how we can find the storage, and if we can make a big disruption in terms of cost decline in India in the context of solar PV and others. Now, I have to leave in 3 minutes, I was told. So lifestyle changes. Now, again, I am sorry to tell you the truth, tell you the thing that I believe is the truth. I don't think that through webinars, through Zoom meetings, we can solve world's energy and climate problems. Today, according to our numbers, only 10% maximum, 10% maximum of the people can work, of the labor force can work from home, only 10%. But 90% comes from India, China, Africa, they don't have this. So therefore, looking at it around our neighbors, our friends, teleworking, not taking the car, and not aviation. Aviation is only 7% of global oil consumption, only 7%. Okay. So therefore, it is, in my view, as I said, the Zoom technology cannot bring us to energy and climate goals, but the right government policies might well do so. Now, oil, exporting countries and solar energy. There is a lot of sun in Middle East and Africa. I was having with an African ministerial meeting with the Senegalese minister. I give you one number which is heartbreaking, in my view, as an energy person who makes his hands dirty with data. Today, 40% of the global solar radiation is coming to Africa, but only 1% of the solar electricity is generated in Africa. Today, the African solar generation capacity is equal to Netherlands, 5 gigawatts, nothing. So therefore, there's a huge opportunity there, and but I am really hopeful because many governments in Africa, slowly but surely, understanding that the energy is very important for the people to be elected, to have the social peace and order to bring energy to the people. Today in Africa, 1 out of 2 people in sub-Saharan Africa, they don't have electricity. And solar is the cheapest there. Not only solar, huge hydropower, natural gas resources, everything there. And talking about finishing with Africa, I don't like it, very frank again, I don't like it when the people outside of Africa tells the Africans, don't use this one in technology, use the other technology. Africa should use what is the most comfortable for them, what is the most suitable for them, what is the most sustainable for them. Africa is responsible only 1.6% of the global emissions, 1.6%. We cannot expect Africa now to save the world to go this way or that way. Of course, solar is very cheap. Africa uses solar. Hydro is very cheap to use hydropower, but Africa should choose what is the best for them, and therefore the rest of the world shouldn't prescribe Africa what to use or what not to use. But again, our numbers are there. Many renewable technologies are very good options, favorable options for Africa. With this, Professor Grab, may I thank you and your colleagues very much. I understand from the provost that I have now an address to visit when I come to London, hopefully very soon. I will be honored to visit you at the UCL, and this time not as a father waiting for the daughter coming from the library, but a friend of the UCL colleagues. It will be a great honor to come and visit you in your very university, in your esteemed university. Thank you very much for that.
And it would be a great pleasure to host you if and when you can do that. And also congratulations, not just for your thoughts and work at the IEA, but for ending on the absolutely perfect note to move on to our first respondent, Yacob Mulugetta. But thank you very much indeed, Dr. Birol. I know that you have an intense schedule. It's great that you could spare the time. I know that Christophe in your office there is also staying with us, and I may turn to Christophe for any final reactions from the IEA at the end of our discussion period, if we have time. But that was great. Very useful insights into the energy world and how it looks from the top of the IEA. Apologies for those who posted questions either that I missed or that came in just after there and couldn't pick up then. I'll try and note some of those for the discussion. But let me now indeed turn finally to our very patient respondents. And Fatih obviously apologies that he couldn't stay to hear your remarks. We'll thrust key points at him afterwards. But perhaps I could first turn to you, Yacob. So for the audience here, Yacob Mulugetta is Professor of Energy and Development Policy at UCL, another entire bit of UCL. Previously at the Center for Environmental Strategy at Surrey, a founding member of the African Policy Center, Climate Policy Center, and involved in the UN Commission for Africa. And I tend to associate you particularly with work and very in-depth and important work in Ethiopia and some of the wider sub-Saharan African issues. So Yacob, we'd be really interested to hear your thoughts on that and indeed your wider experience in UK, low carbon and IPCC issues. Over to you, Yacob.
Well, thanks, Michael, for the invitation and for this, stimulating discussion, but also, no doubt, more to follow through this seminar series. But also, let me say thank you to Dr. Birol and certainly the IEA for producing some really high quality reports in the past few months. They were, I'm sure many of us believe that they were good companions during the lockdown when we are all trying to make sense of the effects of COVID on our services and the economy and even in our own kind of personal lives and sanities. So with that, let me quickly react to a few of Dr. Birol's points. One issue that he raised is that jobs will be lost or are impacted heavily in the wider economy, but also within the energy sector itself. But of course, jobs will be created. The question is what types of jobs, and of course, many of us would argue that creating clean energy jobs require policies, as he indicated, and also investment. So one potential advantage of these new clean energy jobs is that they potentially could be distributed across the energy value chain and across geographies, which could then bring more distributed benefits for people and communities. The second issue that he raised, which resonated with me, was this major drop in primary energy across regions that we have seen in the past couple of 3-4 months. But I guess the key here is that almost all the decline is due to reduction in economic activity, which he alluded to and talked about, rather than any kind of structural changes in the way that energy is produced and used. The question is, what do we mean? What does this mean? And I suppose, it means that unless actions lead to structural changes, emissions are likely to rebound back potentially to where they were before. So in a sense, there is some work, that needs to be done to be able to really make sense of what we mean by a green recovery. The third issue, which is very much, within some of the work that IEA has done, is that electricity has and continues to play a significant role in the global response to the COVID crisis. What we've seen is continuous power supplies that have enabled health systems, facilitated deliveries, and to a large extent also sustained our social interactions. So electricity has shown its huge value for society, perhaps more so than ever. And of course, this is not, as Dr. Birol indicated, a universal picture. We still have a large chunk of the world that has no access to electricity, so plenty of work there to be done. The fourth and final point I would like to raise in relation to his points is that that we've seen that this massive response from governments, pumping somewhere in the order of $8 or $9 trillion into the economy, by and large, to try and avoid collapse. So this new interventionist role is bound to continue into the future, which clearly, is going to change the dynamics of what we understand as governance. So the relationship between the state and other actors is being, reconfigured as we speak. So in many ways, in many respects, Dr. Birol's presentation also resonates strongly with last year's UNEP emissions gap report. In that report, 5 key transition options were identified, which were represented by easy wins, which look into expansion of renewable energy for electrification. That's one. The second is a kind of a broad policy consensus that he talked about briefly, which is the whole coal phase out for rapid decarbonization of the energy system. And again, that's happening across different geographies. The whole question of large co-benefits, the co-benefits of our mitigation actions are going to be important for policymakers. And hence, things like, issues around decarbonizing transport is one to think about, and one that the emission gap report certainly identified. A fourth one is, this hard to abate sectors. This is the heavy fossil dependent industries, and therefore, decarbonizing energy intensive industry is one important, transition option. And finally, the area of leapfrogging potential. Michael, you just brought the issue of Africa, which I will come back to in a moment. So the leapfrogging potential is one other transition option also. Here, we're talking about, avoiding future emissions and ensuring energy access for communities and households, that have been neglected. We're talking about roughly around 1 billion people who have no access to electricity, for example. And so many of these issues and options will certainly also be featured in the upcoming IPCC's 6th assessment report. And as you know, as CLA of Chapter 1, Michael Grubb is in this wonderful position to frame the issues that will define our policy as well as investment discussions over the coming years. So I strongly believe, and we will hopefully hear from him as well, that it is likely that this would be perhaps the most comprehensive report, which will contain strong emphasis to connect climate concerns with development, with well-being, with inequality, justice, etc. Issues that have remained contentious in the past, or have been seen contentious in the past, but have now entered into the mainstream discussions around climate. Now let me go to the issue that you raised, Michael, making a couple of specific points about the region that I know most, which is Africa. So the effects and the horrors of the COVID are, to be quite frank, yet to emerge in terms of their full impacts. but it isn't difficult for many of us to imagine, what will emerge. In the best of times, the region struggles to create jobs, secure livelihoods, and rights as well. And so there's a great deal, a great deal of the heavy impact from the COVID will not just be the direct health effects, but also the heavy economic and social consequences associated with it. So given the significance of the informal sector, we can expect this to be multiplied even more. But more specific to energy, I mean, we've seen some progress that has been registered in regards to energy access and infrastructure investment, and in both centralized and decentralized systems. Unfortunately, what we've seen over the past few weeks, few months, is that these have been affected quite significantly. Off-grid, for instance, off-grid installations have effectively stalled, and utilities, like everywhere else, are struggling to sustain themselves. And I think the same picture also applies to the oil and gas. A recent study led by the UNU INRA in Ghana stresses that stranded assets are likely to face divestment. And this big talk around green stimulus package, it does not spell out the conditionalities that accompany these packages. And finally, development, especially development, as we know it, development in terms of industrialization with renewable energy is still untested. We lack the tools, the institutions, or the empirical experience in this area. So there are some really deep concerns in Africa, across Africa, about the recovery options and what are their implications to social relations and the wider environment. So finally, I'll just close with just a final point. It's worth also taking some lessons from the COVID crisis. I mean, one interesting thing that we've observed over the past few weeks is the responses that have actually worked to protect life first and foremost. And here we're talking about examples in New Zealand, Taiwan, Germany, even the Kerala state in India, that have done so well to address this crisis, and therefore better placed to bounce back, to refocus on their economic recovery. Now, those that have done the reverse, that have chosen to protect the economy only at the expense of social conditions, are still trying to manage themselves out of the pandemic. So in short, I think what this does is it debunks the assumption that the economy is somehow autonomous from human interactions and the constraints imposed by the natural environment. I'll just close by referring to Karl Polanyi's thesis of embeddedness, which is relevant here. He argues that instead of running society as an adjunct to the market, the economic system needs to be embedded in politics, in social relations, and in our natural systems. I think these are really important lessons to take as we face the looming crisis, climate crisis that calls for a real shift in approach and values in designing policies and implementing actions. And these are, I think, very much resonate with quite a lot of what Dr. Birol has said. And thank you very much, Michael.
Wow. Thank you, Yacob, also for covering an extraordinary amount of ground and finishing with some very big picture thoughts there, all in the space of about 10 minutes. So congratulations and thanks. Now, I've been trying to keep an eye on the Q&A. Just before I turn to Siân, I'll just flag two. I've been working out how best to handle them. Let me just flag two in there, and then one to hand on to Siân. This will be a slightly irritating for the question answers and perhaps others, but there's a question that Fatih mentioned, that governments are focused on recovery in jobs, but some countries may consider reboosting traditional fossil fuel industries as a quicker way to recover the economy and create jobs. Could you provide some insights or data to prove that this is not necessarily the case. Thanks. I think all I could do there is say that's precisely what the COVID report does. So if after the data and analysis and arguments on that, it really is well worth having a good look at that report. That is precisely what it sets out to answer. And then I think similarly, a question, sorry, that was from Bojan Wang, from Jean-Michel Glachon. What would be Fatih's recommended way of funding clean energy deployment? Mainly support, what kind, or market-based, what kind of markets? Again, that is picked up somewhat in the recent innovation report. One thing that made this meeting a good timing was the fact that IEA's come out with 3 major reports, as said. And I would encourage people to look at those if you feel your questions are unanswered at the end of the session. But we may pick those in discussions later as well. As the segue into Siân, I just to flag again a couple of questions to be explicit. How should oil exporting countries invest in renewable energy after suffering blows to their oil revenues? That was actually from an anonymous attendee, I realize. And I think one of the specifically around the policies for national governments and supranational organizations in influencing the 75% of oil and gas companies which remain under, I think, public control. But that may be something, Siân, that you could help us with as well. So that was a sort of segue into our second and final respondent. So Siân Bailey is a senior research fellow at the Energy and Environment Resources Programme at Chatham House and conducts research focusing on climate, energy and the extractive industries and was author of the Chatham House report, Left Stranded, Extractive and Energy and Extractives in Carbon Constrained Worlds, and a whole series of other crucial works in this space about the impact on energy and resource exporters. Over to you, Siân.
Thank you, Michael. And let me begin by thanking UCL for the invitation to join today's discussion, and also by thanking Dr. Birol and colleagues at the IEA for their repeated calls for a green recovery from the COVID crisis and for an acceleration of the energy transition. It's a really, really important discussion that we're having here today. Now, Yacob, you brought the conversation back to the socio-economic impacts of the crisis. And with that in mind, I think I'll focus my response today on 3 broad areas. First of all, why the COVID crisis is materially different to the downturns that producer countries have previously faced. Second, how the response to COVID could help producer countries really rethink and reset in terms of fossil fuel dependency more broadly. And third, I'll just touch briefly on transparency and public engagement with the choices that governments make right now in recovery. So on the first point, I think, to put it very simply, this really is a downturn like no other. In terms of the scale of the crisis, and Dr. Birol set out some of the headline numbers for us just now, a decline in energy demand 7 times larger than the global financial crisis, but also because we were talking about a fossil fuel market that was already in crisis long before COVID struck, yet one that was still talking in terms of boom and bust cycles rather than a longer term structural shift. And of course, you know, obviously that shift is driven, yes, by climate commitments. We know that every credible pathway to the long-term goals of the Paris Agreement will require a radical reduction in fossil fuel use, but it's also a transition that is increasingly driven by shifts in the real economy. So some of those advances in technology and the economics of energy, Dr. Birol touched upon, but also by shifts in consumer and investor behavior, and particularly the social acceptance of the fossil fuel industries. And this is particularly the case where air pollution from coal-fired power and urban traffic, for example, is concerned. And COVID has really reinforced many of these drivers. So we've seen very clearly that investments in renewable energy have been far more resilient than those in fossil fuels and carbon-intensive industries through the crisis. We've seen awareness of air pollution growing, and there's of course a growing body of evidence on the links between air pollution and vulnerability to COVID. And of course, the potential for demand side shifts in mobility and in home working to become permanent. And these really raise the prospect of a permanent demand destruction for fossil fuels. So when we talk about where we go from here, I think the extent to which recovery measures seek to catalyze green growth or return to normal, what we're really talking about is the extent to which recovery measures accelerate or delay the transition, because the transition was already happening. And what we know is that the later and the more sudden that transition is, the more disruptive and the more expensive it becomes. And the real question for fossil fuel producing countries is who bears that cost? And what has become increasingly clear in recent years is that the global financial community and many of the international oil companies that are listed in international financial centres like London have been exploring their exposure to climate-related financial risks and thinking about systemic risk and resilience. But there are few comparable discussions in fossil fuel dependent countries, despite the fact that they are the most exposed and in many cases the least resilient to these shifts. So in many cases, there will have been a process of mainstreaming physical climate risk through policy and planning, but there hasn't been a comparable process of mainstreaming transition risk or economic vulnerability through policy and planning. And there are many reasons for that, which we can get into in the discussion. But if that doesn't change, and if fossil fuel producing countries aren't actively engaged in this discussion, there's a very real risk that carbon risk really accumulates in those countries and communities that are least able to bear them. And that, of course, jeopardizes the wider sustainability of the recovery in terms of an equitable and inclusive growth, both between countries and within them. Now, in terms of how the COVID crisis can actually help producer countries reset and rethink fossil fuel dependency, without detracting for a second from the immediate economic distress that many producer countries are facing, the COVID crisis can and should open up space for serious discussions about the future of the fossil fuel industry and the continued viability of fossil fuel-led development pathways. And I will give you two very, very quick examples. The first is the extent to which governments actively engage with downside scenarios for oil and gas. Now, what's clear is that despite the impact that the global financial crisis and the 2014 oil price crash had on national balance sheets, neither the governments of oil and gas producing countries, or in many cases their development partners, traditionally paid much attention to this worst case scenario. And it has proved incredibly difficult to lower political and public expectations around the sector. And certainly in our experience at Chatham House, having run climate risk training sessions and scenario analysis workshops with producer countries over many years, the concept of a sudden and sustained collapse in oil demand is still often met with surprise and comments along the lines of, well, we wouldn't have an oil sector in that case in a $20 barrel world. And yet countries continue to plan for one. Now, by April this year, 1 month into lockdown, we had a very vivid illustration of what demand destruction looks like. And it's worth bearing in mind that that was a 25% decline in oil demand compared to a 75% decline that would be required under most well below 2-degree pathways by mid-century. So while it has never been politically expedient to focus on the worst case scenario, and while the credibility of a sudden collapse in demand has sometimes been questioned by country stakeholders, the impacts of COVID really suggest that it has to be part of the narrative. And more broadly, if we think about the range of recovery measures under discussion, from back to normal to catalysing green growth, it exacerbates that range of uncertainty, and it suggests that market risk and transition risk should really be front and centre in policy and planning. It also, I think there's a question around the extent to which recovery measures can help address much bigger questions around economic resilience and competitiveness, and clearly economic growth and jobs will really be a top priority for every government in the coming months and for development assistance. And as Dr. Birol pointed out, clean energy can be at the heart of that. But it also means looking well beyond the fossil fuel sector and thinking about the path dependencies that tend to flow from the sector. So those linkages between fossil fuels and the wider economy. And one of the challenges here is that many of the for early stage and emerging producers, the success stories of fossil fuel led development, so the Gulf countries, Malaysia, Trinidad and Tobago, they're all based on this development of linked carbon intensive energy systems and industries, petrochemicals, fertilizers, steel. And that may have made sense in the 60s or 70s, but even before the COVID crisis, those producer countries were really facing a race against time to transition to a clean, competitive economy. And for many earlier stage or emerging producers, there simply isn't the time available to develop, diversify, and then reduce dependence from fossil fuels. And that's particularly the case where large-scale LNG infrastructure is under consideration, for instance. And we've done some interesting modeling with colleagues at UCL Energy Institute on Tanzania. There's been a lot of discussion in the press in the last couple of weeks around Mozambique. This is a really live discussion. So to the extent that the COVID crisis can force a reassessment and present an opportunity for countries that had ambitions to follow those pathways to maybe think instead about shielding their economies from climate risk and developing resilient competitive advantages in other areas of the economy, there's a real opportunity here. But as Yacob said, these areas are untested and they will require significant assistance and finance in the right places. And what that means in the context of the green recovery and in an alternative development pathway at the current time remains to be seen. Now, third and very finally, just a few words on transparency and public engagement around the sector. I think if the COVID crisis really teaches us anything, it's the importance of timely and accurate data and of very clear communication and trust between government and civil society. And so in this respect, public debate and public engagement around fossil fuel dependency is long overdue. And certainly where green recovery measures are under consideration or where state support to the sector is under consideration, public engagement is crucial. And so obviously in advanced economies, we've seen state support to fossil fuels and carbon intensive sectors like aviation featuring in initial recovery measures. There was a great question to Dr. Birol on bailouts to the oil and gas sector. And ultimately, if taxpayers are keeping companies afloat, then the extent to which they serve the public interest can and should come under much greater scrutiny. Now, Michael, you touched upon the 75% of oil and gas fossil fuel assets that are in public hands. The difference, of course, is that in many developing countries and in fossil fuel dependent economies, national oil companies are and assets are already in public hands, and they are financed directly through resource revenues or through the national budget. Yet, unlike shareholder engagement with international oil companies, for instance, where there is demands for disclosure and engagement around capital at risk, there is no comparable stakeholder engagement with national oil companies and very limited transparency around the financial flows that surround the sector. So transparency around recovery measures and the extent to which they reinforce high carbon industries and interests, it's crucial in terms of a green recovery, but it could also serve to really reveal the scale of support to the sector and the risks to public finance that entails. So there's a huge opportunity there. And that all of that isn't to say that the oil and gas sector has no role in transition, but that it has a role that requires serious scrutiny. And for that to happen, information about emerging policy and market trends, including climate-related risks, needs to flow much more readily between advanced economies and developing ones and between different stakeholders within economies. And there's a range of existing mechanisms such as the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, the ITI, which we've been working with at Chatham House, Publish What You Pay and others, that will really have to evolve and engage with both the immediate shock that the COVID crisis has presented to fossil fuel dependent economies and the long-term implications of the decisions that are made today in terms of the accumulation of carbon risks and the extent to which countries are prepared for an orderly or disorderly transition. So with that, I think I'm running over time, but to wrap up, I think to summarize, the scale and the nature of the COVID crisis is materially different, and a green recovery can offer fossil fuel dependent countries a chance to break the cycle, but they can't do it alone, and it will require information, dialogue and investment that is geared to support that.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very, very much, Siân and Yacob, and a patient audience as well. Now, I may not have done a great job in chairing in the sense that we have to close this meeting within 5 minutes because it is booked for another Zoom call. I've had a quick skim of questions and we really can't take them all. Some are fairly specific and I won't call those. Let me though perhaps a touch of reassurance. We'll have a record of the questions and they will also help to inform some of the topics that we build into some of the future seminars in this series. So your comments will not go unnoticed. Some may just either be better addressed offline or more technical or picked up in future discussions. There was a general question about what on earth, and I think from Gernot Klepper, about hasn't carbon pricing been mentioned, is there a reason for it? Well, I can't speak for Fatih Birol. He covered a lot of ground, as did discussants. I guess insofar as there is a reason for it, it's that, well, governments have been trying for several decades and it's politically very difficult. But there is a case to be said that it's when our energy prices are going down is a political window of opportunity for carbon pricing. But that's sort of one comment I'd make. But I do think the energy world generally has recognizes the challenge is much more complicated than just you need to put a price on carbon for all the reasons that have been touched on and many more. And the politics of that are not easier than some of the other steps required. Obviously, there's a whole question or issue around hydrogen. We will aim to pick that up later, perhaps in the context also of the future of the gas industry. But the question from Richard around the IEA report on hydrogen and Japan's role and what's the IEA plans. And also a question, and Christoph, I hope you're still with us, about inconsistency of oil and gas methane leakage mentioned in previous IEA reports, but is there really much progress? Do you see significant opportunity? Finally, there was a question from Luke Wheeler about citizen engagement. I think, Siân, in your comment, you at least implicitly said, you know, this is a challenge that involves wider society, that does employ that, you know, there's sort of a democratic recovery as well as a technical one, I think was the phrase used in that question. Perhaps I'll leave that as a thought for the wider audience, but I'd suggested I might try and find time in a couple of minutes for Christoph McGlade from the IEA. I hope you've been with us and are still with us. If there's any final remark you'd like to make, having heard all this on behalf of the IEA, and I'm sorry I haven't been able to sort of get back with more discussion, but our time was constrained here and we covered a huge ground. Christoph, any last words from yourself? You're muted, of course. But also silent. We may have missed you. Christoph, a last call if you're wanting to come in. Well, I'm sure we can also relay comments back to Christoph and the IEA. And in fact, perhaps those ones I mentioned, we will email over. I will do so after this call. And hopefully Christoph or others could get back to you on those more specific ones. But as said, we had a maximum of an hour and a half. We've had a great talk from Fatih, a lot of good questions and thoughtful answers. A real thanks also to both our discussants there, Yacob and Siân. Some very thoughtful reflections. Actually, I want to go over, I'll probably do rarely I will listen to the recordings again and check my notes because there's a lot of things. And as I say, part of this session's intent was to tee up issues that we reflect on regarding future design of future meetings and the key topics. So at least from my selfish perspective, it's done that job great and has been a fantastically enjoyable and interesting session. Again, apologies to those of you we couldn't take forward in more detail. I hope you've all enjoyed it. And with 1 minute to go, unless Christoph is jumping in, no, I don't see that. I will just thank you all very much for your participation and for patient listening as well. Thanks very much, and we'll be back in touch with you with the next steps.
Thanks, Michael.
Cheers.
Thanks all.
Bye-bye.
Cheerio. Bye.
Bye.